Good morning or good evening, wherever you're joining us from around the world. Welcome to the 9th episode of the Voices of Sustainability virtual fireside chat series. I'm Julia Pyper, and I'm thrilled to be moderating this discussion in my capacity as a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council and a Zayed Sustainability Prize selection committee member. The Zayed Sustainability Prize was established in 2008 as the United Arab Emirates' pioneering global award for recognizing organizations and global high schools for their sustainable, innovative, and humanitarian solutions. Today, the prize counts 14 years of global impact, with 370 million people around the world benefiting from its winners' solutions across the categories of health, food, energy, water, and global high schools. The prize recently welcomed a new cohort of sustainability pioneers at its 2022 awards ceremony in January, which was held as part of the Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week. Before I go in to introduce the full panel, I'd like to first set the scene for today's episode. With COP26 and Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week behind us, we'll reflect on the progress made on the Paris Agreement back in 2015 to where we are today, shortly after COP26, just last November in Glasgow. We'll also explore the impact of post-pandemic recovery on climate adaptation and mitigation. The discussion will also address current global decarbonization efforts and what countries and industry are doing to raise their net zero ambitions and further mobilize finance for the climate. So now let me introduce our esteemed group of speakers today. First, we're joined by Madame Laurence Tubiana, who's the CEO of the European Climate Foundation and a professor at Sciences Po Paris. Laurence was France's climate change ambassador, special representative for COP21, and as such, a key architect of the landmark Paris Agreement. Following COP21 and through COP22, she was appointed UN High-Level Champion for Climate Action. We're also joined by Rachel Kyte, who is the 14th Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Prior to joining Fletcher, Dean Kite served as a special representative of the UN Secretary General and Chief Executive Officer of Sustainable Energy for All. She previously was the World Bank Group Vice President and Special Envoy for Climate Change, leading the run-up to the Paris Agreement. Next, we're joined by David Sandalow, who is the inaugural fellow at the Center of Global Energy Policy and co-director of the Energy and Environment Concentration at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. He founded and directs the center's US-China program and is author of The Guide to Chinese Climate Policy. David also serves as a selection committee member of the Zayed Sustainability Prize in the energy category. Last but certainly not least is Adnan Amin, who served as the Director General of the International Renewable Energy Agency, or IRENA, from April 2011 to April 2019. In his first 2 terms, IRENA became the authoritative voice on renewable energy and a leading player in the global energy transition. Since 2019, Mr. Amin has been a senior fellow at the Harvard Belfer Center. He also serves on the jury of the Zayed Sustainability Prize. It's an honor and delight to be with all of you today. Thanks so much for being here. So, time to launch into the discussion. First, Madame Tubiana, I'd like to start with you. So from your position as France's climate change ambassador and special representative for COP21, you were one of the key contributors to the Paris Agreement, which really set the stage for a lot of climate action we're still talking about today. That deal truly changed the course of history. So a lot has happened since then, but if you could sort of look back at recent years, how would you assess the progress that has been made on climate today? And what do you think are the biggest, gaps and missing pieces or setbacks in the process so far?
Thank you for inviting me to that nice fire chat. I think we have come quite a long way since Paris. That was the first, in a way, the start of a new regime, which was based on an element of every country committing to climate plans, what we call the national determined contribution, and some which were the bottom-up aspect, the unilateral aspect, if you will, of the regime, and then adding to that some elements of a top-down approach, which was in trying to have a framework where every country will come regularly to increase ambition with a set of rules of transparency on carbon markets, and at the same time, a goal in particular to be globally about net zero emission by 2050 or around that time, and getting to net negative after that. So there was this mix of instrument. In a way, these 5-6 years now was of course key to know if it was working or not. And we have had this really very sad withdrawal of US during these 5 years that has of course an impact on many aspects. So what we can witness is this framework is resilient. As you know, it's a framework where everybody refers to, and not only the countries, the government who sign up to that, who are the official signatories of the Paris Agreement, but many other institutions are referring to Paris as a goal, as a benchmark, as the framework they have to refer to and be aligned with. It's a case for example, a number of financial institutions, public and private, and more businesses and local authorities at the same time. So Paris is now the goal of Paris, being consistent with that pathway that brings us to 2050 is a common, in a way, the common point, the common really endeavor. And so that's a very positive element. We have seen many countries signing up for net zero by 2050, many companies. We have seen some increased ambition in Glasgow. It was a moment where the countries has to, in a way, upgrade their contribution. So this is all good, and in a way, we have a resilient regime there, that's for sure. But now we run late, we are running late. We were already running late in Paris, and we had to accelerate during this last 6 years, and we haven't really, even if progress has been made on a number of sectors, technologies, which anyway was not totally anticipated in Paris. I'm thinking, for example, as electrification of transport, or well, mainly diesel evolution, but again, an enormous lowering of the cost of renewable energy, which my colleagues on the screen know very well of. But the science is stark now, and we need much serious deep decarbonization now, process and plans. We need urgent support for finance, adaptation, and the loss and damage for the countries and the groups who are not, anyway, we can't sustain the severity of the impacts. And all this, including the ambition that is not there, in particular on the short term, to by 2030, we should be decreasing global emissions. That was the conclusion of Glasgow, by 45% in 2030, and we are not taking that route for the moment. So I have it's in a way an anxiety, in a way, in the way we delay, and at the same time, we have all the instruments, at least on most sectors and more governments, to deliver. So now the problem is implementation, and I would add, to end with that, accountability is not enough to commit to numbers. It's really very substantial and important to commit to plans, to disclose this plan and to implement them. So everything, in my view, on the next few years, and in particular going to Sharm el-Sheikh, very important conference, and for the global stocktake 1 year after, is everything is about accountability. We need trust. We need confidence that the process is going on, and acceleration of action.
Okay, so evolving from frameworks now to really implementation, accountability, trust, a key word I think there. So thank you very much for setting the scene. Dean Kite, I'd like to go to you next. You were an advisor to the UK government for the recent COP26 in Glasgow. The net zero commitments and decarbonization were really embedded as part of everyone's vocabulary over those few months. We saw a lot of commitments, a lot of promises. First of all, before I get into some specifics at COP26 on carbon markets, I want to ask what your top line takeaway was from COP26. Where did that put us in the dialogue today and action ultimately?
Well, thank you. It's lovely to be here. Lovely to be here with great minds and great friends. Well, I think one very important thing happened, which is that net zero was the currency of COP26. And there have been some arguments about whether or not it's a useful framing, and whether or not it's the idea of being net zero by mid-century is too far off. But actually, it's become a unifying concept. And what we saw in Glasgow actually was most attention going on, and what are you going to do about it right now? So we may need to be at net zero by mid-century, but we have to, by the end of this decade, have made swinging cuts in emissions, 45%. It's got to happen. And you saw that both in terms of governments coming with plans for 2030, pressure on governments to say what they're going to do by 2030, and you saw the private sector itself making net zero commitments, also coming and saying, and by 2030 we will have reached this part of the journey. So I think that we saw a worldwide embrace of net zero as a concept, commitments being made, and now those commitments are not enough. Some of those commitments are too fuzzy, too vague, not clear enough about what they really mean, and that's where the attacks of greenwashing come. But I think we sort of saw a gathering around, again, a flag in the sand that had been planted, first of all in Paris, and you saw a sort of unity of purpose. Now, politics will get in the way. Is everybody good for the commitment that they made? That's the process of accountability and trust that Laurence talked about. But I thought that Glasgow was really a story of every part of the economy, every government struggling with how they're actually going to implement the commitment to net zero, rather than should we or should we not be at net zero.
I remember hearing you speak at COP26, and you said something along the lines of, this is sort of climbing up an ice wall, and you put another kind of ice pick in there, and you haul yourself up, and it creates another little wedge and another little anchor, if you will, to build off of. It's not everything, but we're moving up the mountain, so to speak. And that image kind of stuck with me. I want to ask specifically, Dean Kite, about carbon markets, since that was a really another central idea of COP26. One of the achievements was a rule book was put together on international cooperation through carbon markets, the Article 6 rules. So what do you think it will practically take to regulate carbon markets effectively? Did we get the framework we needed out of the talks that week?
Yeah, so it's a good news story with a lot of caveats, right? So I think the important thing is that we finally agreed the rule book, as you said, on Article 6, which is carbon markets and trade in carbon between governments. So now the UN has to establish supervision of how that's going to happen, and all the detail has to be filled in. And that's going to operate on a timeline which is not going to persuade a lot of people that this is going to go very quickly. What we're seeing at the same time then is an explosion of interest in voluntary use of carbon markets, which is not a new thing. There have been voluntary carbon markets for decades, but this is being driven now by the pressing need of many countries to attract resources in to help them with their adaptation in particular. So these are countries that have excess credit. So maybe Ghana or Colombia or Gabon, countries which are forested, or countries which are stewarding their natural resources and wanting financial flows into that. And it's also being driven by the fact that we have hundreds of trillions of dollars of private sector commitments of firms and financial institutions who say that they will achieve net zero. And in order for them to do so, they need to find some way, in some cases, to use voluntary carbon markets. And this is where the attack of greenwashing comes, that some companies are suggesting that they would offset their emissions rather than reduce them. So what we're seeing now, and this is a big news for 2022 and big news, I think, in the run up to the UAE's COP28 in 2023, is a lot of what I would call hybrid rulemaking between the private sector and government and civil society and indigenous peoples, etc., around how these voluntary markets will work. And what we're actually doing is building a purposeful market. We don't need a carbon market just to move a carbon credit around from one ledger to another. We need carbon markets to reduce emissions, speed the transition, direct finances into things that are necessary, for example, off-grid renewable energy for poor communities in developing countries. And we need this flow of finance to be steady and growing to actually fund adaptation in developing countries. So I think the concept of a market not just being a correction for market failure, but actually being purposeful, is at the heart of what you will now see as we try to establish the guardrails and the rules for voluntary carbon markets. And that, in and of itself, is, you could understand the voluntary carbon markets, hopefully, as a glide path to fully regulated markets, and hopefully regulation around effective carbon pricing everywhere.
Great. Okay, bringing more of our great esteemed guests into the conversation here. David, I'd like to go to you next. We're having this conversation in the wake of Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week, which is a global platform for that sees policymakers, industry specialists, technology pioneers, and others gather to accelerate sustainable deployment and development. And so as a universal issue, climate change also requires a global response from all these different actors and sectors, albeit while there's all this diversity of action, the countries that are affected are engaging differently and are being affected differently at the same time. So both a universal issue and something that requires tailored solutions. So what aspects of reaching net zero particularly do you think require multilateral action? And how can international cooperation be strengthened and secure an inclusive response to climate change and the climate emergency, given we also need to account for the diversity of need around the world?
Thank you, Julia, and congratulations to the Zayed Prize and for all the great people that you've empowered over so many years. And congratulations to this year's winners of the Zayed Prize. It's really inspiring, all the amazing work that you're doing. You asked about multilateral action. I think almost all aspects of reaching net zero require multilateral action. Climate change is a global problem. It's a classic global problem. The heat trapping gases that we are pouring into the atmosphere mix globally, and there's no solution without countries coming together and people from around the world coming together to solve the problem. I think we need multilateral action to mobilize the best minds around the world, to spread awareness and much more. And the Paris Agreement that Ambassador Tubiana was so instrumental in shaping is a perfect example of this. The Paris Agreement finds a way to encourage all companies or all countries to regularly increase their ambition, to ratchet up their ambition, and it provides a platform that almost requires capitals around the world to pay attention to this issue on a sustained basis. You know, one thing I found from working on climate change for many years is that one of the challenges of this issue is that it is a crisis caused by invisible and odorless gases. And although it shapes our lives, it's not hard for people in the ordinary course of their lives to not pay attention, precisely because it is an invisible and odorless gas that causes the problem. And the Paris Agreement provides structure for making people pay attention. There are other multilateral structures. The Clean Energy Ministerial comes to mind. I think it's a platform of energy ministers who come together from around the world to promote innovation on clean energy and common projects on clean energy. And we need more innovative structures like that. You asked what we can do to improve multilateral structures. I think three areas come to mind for me. First is sectoral cooperation, in particular in industrial sectors. And I think we've done a really good job at the Paris Agreement of finding ways that the countries around the world need to pay attention. We've done a less good job of figuring out how companies need to come together, particularly companies in the same sector. There was some progress on this at Glasgow, but I think we need to do more in terms of sectoral cooperation. A second area is on financial cooperation. This has gotten a lot of attention. The developed world has not done enough to transfer resources to the developing world that are needed to address this. And in parts of the developing world, there hasn't been enough taking of responsibility in this regard. I think capital will only flow to places that have good governance structures, where corruption is not an endemic problem. And I think in many parts of developing world, there needs to be significant improvement on that front in order for capital to flow at the levels that we need to address the climate change problem. And then a final issue that I think gets much too little attention, it's the food system. And the food system is responsible for 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And I find it doesn't get nearly the attention that other sectors receive. And of course, climate change directly affects the food system in ways that are going to be, extremely dangerous in the years ahead. So I hope that this issue will get more attention in the coming COPs, COP27, COP28. And I particularly want to congratulate the United Arab Emirates for its leadership in this area. It founded, along with the US government this year, the Agricultural Innovation Mission for Climate, AIM-C, it's been called, which I think is a really important part of the multilateral solution to this problem and a good example of the type of steps that we need to take.
Are you saying my little compost under my sink isn't enough? We got to do more than that.
It's a great start, and everybody can do their part, but absolutely, we need to do more.
For sure. Mr. Amin, I'd like to bring your voice in here now. So as IRENA's first Director General, you led the agency into expanding its reach to close to universal membership. And you did that by working with countries to accelerate the uptake of renewables, which of course are now a mainstay of many energy systems around the world. Today, we know that renewables offer a readily available, practical action tool for reaching carbon neutrality. With technology costs significantly dropping in recent years, what are some of the key barriers that remain in completing the energy transition at the global level, and especially in developing countries?
Thank you very much, Julia. And let me say what a great pleasure it is to be with this panel of old friends. And I very much enjoyed the comments they made, which I think are spot on. I was thinking back on my tenure at IRENA, and the two big challenges, I think, were one, creating the knowledge framework around renewables, technology, policy, cost, etc. And the other was helping countries create the frameworks for investment. And I think on both of those, there was some substantial success, and it's really taken off. And if you think back, when I started, we had a minuscule share of renewables in the global energy system. During my tenure, the cost of renewable energy fell exponentially. I think solar by over 90%, wind by 50, 60%. Geothermal costs came down as risks came down, and so on. And we saw capacity additions, in the last 3 years of my tenure, from renewables to the global power system exceeded all others. So the speed of growth was extremely fast. We've reached, I think, around 27% now in the global system, but that's nowhere near enough for the decarbonization ambition that we have coming out of the Paris Climate Agreement. I agree with Laurence. I still remember her on the stage and the euphoria that everybody had that night, Laurence. It was an extraordinary moment. But we've meandered a little bit since then. There have been ups and downs. I think both David and Rachel spoke about some of those. But as far as energy is concerned, I think it depends on how governments deal with the kind of challenges that we have today. And those challenges, I think somebody mentioned one was capital. We're seeing the cost of capital for renewables coming down finally. We're seeing risk being priced for fossil assets in a different way. So exploration and production for fossils has gone down. Incentives for renewables are going up. I just saw the news today that China installed a record amount of renewables capacity, especially wind power, in their system just this year. They exceeded, I think, the second largest wind country is the UK, which is about 10 gigawatts, and the Chinese have exceeded that 4 times in 1 year. So while they are still adding coal capacity, they're also moving very fast on renewables. And in the longer term, we have to see what wins out and what the policy frameworks are going to be. And David knows this much better than I do. But you also see countries like India and Vietnam that have become superstars on renewables. You're seeing emerging economies in Asia, which are moving very fast. There are bright spots in Africa, in Latin America, but there still remains a lot to be done. And I think part of the issue is capital. I was a little bit disappointed, I must say, at Glasgow by one thing, which was that the whole focus became about the emerging economies that are still facing developing challenges, becoming the villains for decarbonization, for emissions. While we failed to really address the capital issue, the finance issue, we failed to address the adaptation issue, and we failed to address one issue, which I think is critical for trust, which Laurence mentioned, which is how do we look at loss and damage? How do we look at equity and climate justice in the longer term? So I think these are big issues in energy decisions in the future. And I think that countries that are in a position to provide that kind of support for the transition to weaker countries, to developing countries, really need to think about what the options are and put in place the means to do that. I think policy frameworks have improved exponentially, which is why we're seeing even in developing countries, renewables are really making strides. Just want to remind David that corruption is not just a developing country issue. It's almost a universal issue these days. But what we face are decisions which are much more existential in developing countries than they are in developed countries. I'm on the African Climate Foundation Advisory Board, and we've been discussing the future of gas in Africa. We've had big recent discoveries of gas, Mozambique, Tanzania, etc. We have huge oil and gas companies, Total and others, which are very active in supporting those countries to go in the direction of gas. Those countries also have huge renewable capacity. And the argument we are making is that the energy transition is going to make many of these fossil assets stranded assets in the near term. So if we thought that developing countries had a debt crisis, when they have to deal with the debt for stranded assets, which are in the hundreds of billions, it's going to be a massive problem, both for development and for climate in the coming time. So those are the kind of issues that we need to look at. I think a big challenge is how do we attack the hard to decarbonize sectors where abatement is difficult. One of the solutions we have, which is emerging as a big solution, is hydrogen, potentially ammonia for transportation, for industry heat and power. I think there is a lot of potential, but there's a lot to do in terms of investing in innovation in technology and reducing the cost, because I see the competition around investment in electrolyzers is drawing the cost down, but we need to have substantial speed around that process so that we get to a point where hydrogen actually becomes cost competitive and then green hydrogen begins to dominate. I think there are a lot of question marks around the gray and blue hydrogen today. I think Rachel correctly spoke about the greenwashing issue. We have to be very careful of that in the whole discussion about hydrogen, but I think that is emerging as an issue that we will face in the future. My final point is that we're living at a time of tremendous geopolitical instability, and a lot of that is also around energy. If you look at the debate around gas in Europe today, you look at the messaging that comes from special interest groups around the unreliability of renewables. If you look at the sourcing that we see all the developed countries are going to right now to compensate for a deficit of energy during the winter months, these are all issues that distract you from what the long-term picture has to be. And the long-term picture has to be a diversified, decentralized, intelligent, digitalized system based on renewable generation that is able to be flexible enough to meet the needs of both consumers, society, industry, but that can take us to a safer place in terms of decarbonization and meeting the Paris targets.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. I know geopolitics of energy has been covered on previous Voices of Sustainability episodes. It's its own massive topic. Let me quickly ask a follow-up to that. You said, places around the world are contemplating whether their fossil fuel assets could be stranded. To what extent can renewables meet the needs then? Is there a magic number of 50, 80%? Can renewables truly do it all? Or are we going to have to find more tailored solutions and diverse solutions, especially as we get further up the percentage of decarbonization?
I think we have to understand that there's no silver bullet. And we have to understand that fossil fuel as an energy source is not going to end tomorrow. What we're talking about is how do we get to the point of the evolution of the energy system that is decarbonized enough to keep us within safe limits, because we're not going to, in the short term, at least in the next decade that Rachel mentioned as a critical time for climate decision making, to eliminate fossil fuels. It's not going to happen. The question is, how do we look at decarbonizing fossil fuels or reducing carbon intensity of fossils, increasing efficiency in industry, housing, stock, et cetera, But the other part of it is that renewables today in developing countries can meet much of the needs that we have. For the electricity system, I'm from Kenya. We have close to 80% renewables in our system because we have geothermal, hydro, solar, and wind. We have a system that among the sub-Saharan African countries is probably much more reliable than others. Costs are also much more manageable than others. And it demonstrates that countries that begin to utilize their resources can move in a decarbonized direction, but they need help with technology, innovation, they need help with capital, reducing costs, etc. So I think that's a critical thing. And the other issue is, on this argument, renewables versus fossils, I saw a very interesting number where they said the total amount of acreage in the United States that you would need for solar to power the entire United States is 14 million acres. I don't know, David, if you're familiar with this. Mm-hmm. But we currently have 30 million acres under corn, which is for ethanol for mixing with fossil fuels. I mean, these are the kind of absurdities that we need to really deal with, because these are suboptimal both economically and environmentally and socially, incidentally. So I think these are the kind of questions which are in a way universal almost that we need to address.
Great, thank you very much. So you teed up the next question nicely there. Dean Kite, I'd like to return to you and get your thoughts on this finance piece. So at COP26, high-income nations recommitted to hit a target of $100 billion of climate finance by 2023. That's after having missed their original target to hit that level in 2020. So despite the delay, climate finance is starting to flow. Do you consider this target sufficient? And where else do you think we need to go on climate finance commitments? And to what extent does private play a role, private sector, versus the public dollars that we're talking about here?
So the short answer is no, it's not sufficient. A more nuanced answer is that climate finance has its origins decades ago in a conversation where we had sort of climate action siloed separately from development, from economic growth, and sort of the society in general. And so promises were made and promises have not been kept by developed countries to those who've done little to get us into this crisis in the first place, and who are suffering the real effects of climate change now, impacts, and who are struggling for their pathways to adaptation. And as Laurence has already mentioned, and Adnan as well, this concept of loss and damage as well, that we are actually going to have to pay for the impacts of climate change in places where the problems didn't originate. So the 100 billion is a totemic number. It has to be met. It's a promise. It's about the trust and the underpinning of sort of international cooperation on these issues. But the financial flows that are needed are much greater, and are transfers of public funds, the use of public funds domestically, and then public transfers of internationally of funds, and then private investment, domestic and international. So it's all of the above. And what we're not doing is sending very strong, clear signals. Regulation is far behind. We don't have effective prices on carbon, which would allow markets to go faster. In many jurisdictions. And in many jurisdictions, we do have carbon pricing, but it's not effective and it doesn't cover enough parts of the economy. And as Adnan has said, one of the biggest weaknesses in the Glasgow construct, and I think now in the follow-up and the implementation, is that there's been lots of advocacy around what mustn't be done, what public money should not be used to finance. Public money should not follow previous rounds of public money into coal, into now some countries are saying no international financing of fossil fuels at all. So we've been very good at sort of establishing what we shouldn't be doing, because it will be a stranded asset and it's not a good investment. But the money hasn't been there in a similar fashion for what does need to be invested in. And we started to see platforms of public and private money coming together, for example, to help South Africa decarbonize more quickly than it would do on its own. That's great. That commitment is there, but it's a politically fragile commitment and it has to be implemented. Now the Secretary General has asked for Indonesia and Vietnam to be able to be prioritized as countries that international cooperation should come around with public and private finance flowing to a rapid decarbonization. And that is getting out of the contracts that you have for coal today, but it's fundamentally about investing in smart grids, and the green power substitutions for fossil fuels. So there is a massive mobilization necessary to invest in the green power transition, electric mobility transition. Laurence is in the Financial Times today talking about the need to think differently about the deep sort of refurbishment of our built environment, and that's both in developed and developing countries. So there's much that we need to invest in, and that's going to require large amounts of private money and public money, which means that the price signals and the constructs from the public sector are very important. We need to regulate this. Central banks need to say where risk is and what they would like to see. There needs to be public policy for procurement, for incentives into green investment, and it has to be root and branch. And that's what we're missing. And in the absence of that, developing countries will say, well, you know, you're not interested in helping us with our transition. We are, by the way, suffering from debt and other issues made worse by the pandemic. And really, we have very much reasons to doubt that solidarity is really there. And I think that holds back the kinds of conversations that we can have. The good news, hopefully, is that the private sector can see the direction of travel. But we could do much more if we were more consistent in our public policy. But it's macroeconomic and fiscal policy. It's not just the 100 billion.
Absolutely.
Right. And we did see at COP26 the private sector committing, well, private sector players with trillions of assets under management, I think representing around 40% of global assets, did commit to climate action. Of course, not every one of those dollars will go into climate solutions, which I think was sort of misunderstood perhaps, but nonetheless, a flag planted there. And your point's taken on roots to branch, because I think even the dollars that have mobilized are not necessarily making it into people's hands who really deserve it the most. There's these blockages that I've learned about lately, including on a podcast I host, Political Climate, where people are really trying to do that work on the ground to capacity build and accept those dollars and put them into implementation, as we've been saying. Madame Tubiana, let me return to you for a moment. So we've talked about a lot of different levers here. What are some of the most effective policy-making tools that you see to address climate change today? And let me also add, to what extent do you think climate science needs to be better incorporated into this decision-making?
First, on the policy instrument, what we see is that, as Adnan said, there is no one that can deliver everything. That now really very well grounded in past experience. And you see that on one side, of course, the main problem having a sort of a free range pollution without any price is a problem. So certainly the price instruments are still very important and still not fully implemented by far. But at the same time, if we want to implement them more broadly, we have to anticipate the social consequences of a different, because there are, of course, negative distributed effects, depending on the level of income, the type of practical circumstances you have. So there is this, and it was a pricing policy, but now thinking it in terms of what the distributed impact and how to deal with them. And that's true for every country, not necessarily the developed one. But you see at the same time that you need a whole range of policy instruments to convince all actors that they have to, because there are so many choices you have to make to reduce emission when you are a business leader, or when you are a consumer, or when you are a financial investor. And there is no one instrument or one signal that makes it all. So that's why this combination of regulation, Rachel was mentioning how you go from voluntary carbon markets to mandatory regulation. This, of course, is the type of national policies that are important. And, you know, the enforcement of Paris Agreement beyond the rules and the frameworks and the sort of peer review element, the main element is about national law. So it's to translate in each case the Paris Agreement provision into national law. So that's the progress we have to make. And finally, I think we need plans. You know, it's particular, the way we want to get emission reduction, the goals of Paris, both in finance as well as on industry or transport or housing, or everything. It's not about spontaneous change. It will not happen by miracle or just by the normal innovation process. It could, but that's not what is happening and what not is needed, because we have to go very, very fast. Of course, there's some emission in some sectors have gone down, some have plateaued, some are still rising. And you see that the innovation wave, all this is good and beneficial, but doesn't get us where we have to go, where we have to be in now 8 times or even for the next 30 years. So this is a particular moment in history where this technological, economic, organizational revolution has to be led by the goals we want to get there. And that's why we need a multiple instrument. And sometimes to be really agile is one doesn't work, how to get there. And that's why, in a way, this, because it's a get across the board, so many actors, from farmers to, in the way, business leaders, we need an element of the signal that everyone understands and sees that is an inevitable direction to take. And so that's why it's not heterodox from the economic science point of view normally, but we know many, and we know we need standards as well as communication, as well as name and shame, as well as NGO pressure, as well as local authorities decision making. We need this all. It's not, again, not orthodox from any point of view, governance, economic theory, even innovation, but we know all of this. We have to be all hands on deck. And science, sorry, because right. I forgot to, science is absolutely crucial, that the scientists put the problem before our eyes. They have to be involved at every level of the decision we are making. And that's not the case still.
Great. Well, returning to Mr. Sandalow, as we start to wind down our conversation here, I do want to bring in innovation. We know we have a lot of the solutions we need today, but nonetheless, there are still many sectors where we don't, or we need better ones. So in your 2020 book, Energizing America, a roadmap to launch a national energy innovation mission, you explore the role of clean energy technologies in unlocking decarbonization of the global economy. So what are some of the policy and investment considerations driving clean energy innovation that you think we need and really could yield some co-benefits, socio and economic benefits that we also need to see along with climate action?
Oh, it's such an important topic. Thank you for bringing into the dialogue. Let me make 3 points about innovation. First, innovation is essential to reach net zero. Adnan has already spoken about the remarkable progress that we've made in solar and wind power costs in the past decade. And it's really, I think, nothing short of a miracle to see the 90% drop in solar costs. That progress is essential, but it is not nearly enough for us to get to net zero. In order for the world to reach net zero emissions, we're going to need innovation of a similar scale in a range of areas. We've made great progress in energy storage, for example, but we need more, particularly long duration energy storage in our power systems. We urgently need innovation in the hard to abate industrial sectors. The production of heat for industry produces about 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And the bad news from a climate standpoint is that fossil fuels are just very good at producing high grade heat. They burn at high temperatures. You can stockpile them. There's a global infrastructure to develop them. We urgently need innovation across a range of areas in order to produce heat for the industrial sectors that keep much of modern society going. We need innovation in aviation sector, in the shipping sector, and in the food systems, as I've already discussed. So point one, innovation is essential. Point two, innovation is not necessarily clean. And this is a point that I think is sometimes missed in the dialogue. For example, there has been remarkable innovation in the past several decades in our ability to extract hydrocarbons from the deep ocean. I mean, that required a lot of energy innovation, but it doesn't do anything to help us solve the climate problem. In fact, it goes in the other direction in many cases. So innovative capacity is really important. But we need to keep an eye, not on innovation, but on clean innovation, on innovation that helps us get to net zero emissions. And a third point is that therefore we need policy to guide innovation. We need policy signals of the that have already been discussed. We need carbon prices, we need regulations, we need spending by governments on supporting innovation. All of that will help us get to the innovation that we need. And one particular area that I think is exciting that Rachel mentioned and others have discussed is in climate finance. I think there's really interesting innovation happening right now in the finance sector with respect to climate change. We're seeing climate disclosure regulations that are coming in around the world. We're seeing supervision of the banking system and stress tests in the banking world that I think are innovative and really important. And I think that's a very important place for policy innovation to help make sure we get the innovation right.
Great. All right, I have one more question for Mr. Amin before we do one rapid fire round to close us out here. So first of all, Mr. Amin, the 28th session of the Conference of Parties to the UNFCCC, known as COP28, that will be coming up in a couple of years, will take place actually in the United Arab Emirates in November 2023. So how do you see COP28 further strengthening the UAE's position as a climate action leader and for honestly the globe as well? What kind of flag do you think that event has the opportunity to plant?
Thank you very much, Julia. I'm relieved the rapid fire is after I speak. Let me say, I've had the honor over the last year, Harvard was basically shut down by COVID. I didn't want to sit in cold Cambridge twiddling my thumbs. I've been in the UAE much of this time as a senior advisor to the UAE government on climate. And there were two major tasks that we had over the last year. One was to really interrogate the concept of net zero and what it would mean for a hydrocarbon exporting country like the UAE. And the other was a campaign that the UAE embarked on to host COP28. I met Rachel in the street at Glasgow, and she was quite intrigued by this whole thing. On net zero, it's been a fascinating process. It's been a very in-depth, strongly contested issue, but the country has announced that it will be net zero by 2050. It's a huge thing for a hydrocarbon producer, but there are two things in the end that really made the decision. One was that the leadership of the UAE, starting with the late Sheikh Zayed, has always stressed the need for diversifying the economy, knowing that you cannot rely on only one resource and knowing that particular resource may be under pressure in the future. So there has been, over the last couple of decades, a very strong focus on diversification. The UAE 15 years ago started investing in renewables, invested in the first low carbon city, Masdar city. Today, it hosts two of the largest solar farms in the world, achieving prices of around 1.3 US cents a kilowatt hour, which is among the lowest in the world. Even as far as the national oil company is concerned, the national oil company has made an agreement to source 100% of its power from renewables and nuclear. They have the ambition of reducing the carbon intensity of UAE oil so that it becomes a preferred source in the future. And they have embarked on an ambitious program for diversification, including hydrogen. And the first shipments of hydrogen, blue hydrogen with carbon capture and storage, have already been shipped to Japan and Korea. So there is a real intent here to look at the opportunity for net zero as an economic opportunity, which is, I think, the ideology that we really need for climate, which is that we need to have economies that will prosper as a result of climate action in the future, rather than seeing climate action as a constraint on economic growth. And I think that's the reason why the countries in the Asia-Pacific group agreed to support the UAE as host of COP28. It was not uncontested, but even the competitors in the end agreed that it made sense in the UAE because the UAE articulated a very compelling vision. And that vision essentially, and building on what the colleagues have said, especially Laurence and Rachel, that we've meandered on climate action really since Paris. COP28 will be the first global stocktake. That will really give us a very good metric in terms of how we need to move on 1.5 if we still have that ambition. And the 5-year program that we'll put in place as a result of the stocktake will be decisive in terms of whether the international community meets the 1.5 ambition or not. I think, Rachel mentioned the window of a decade, but I think that, this is a 7-year period we're looking at, which I think is going to be decisive. So I think from that point of view, the approach that the UAE is taking to COP28 is to make it a COP that focuses on solutions, a COP that focuses on practical economic action, best practices, a COP that creates a groundswell of support for solutions that can decarbonize in the future in industry, in mobility, in power generation, and so on, and to really create a narrative that says that we have the opportunity now to re-engineer our economies. I think the other colleagues were talking about the fact that it has to be a multifaceted approach to how we think about economy in the future. And I think that is really what the UAE is focused on. The example of the UAE has had an effect in the region. You can see others have started to go in this direction quite strongly, although we had some skepticism in the beginning, but we won the day. And I think that the ambition for the COP28 is that we have 2 years to prepare this. We need to create the partnerships and the inclusiveness, but especially we need to address those issues, I think, which Laurence raised right at the beginning, or was it Rachel, that we need to bring back trust. So those elements of the climate discussion that have not been addressed adequately will have to be addressed. Adaptation, food security, all of these sort of issues will be critical to that.
I do want to ask just for everyone's one word, no explanations, unfortunately, but if you had to define the future of sustainability, this is the Voices of Sustainability series, what would be that word to describe the future? I just heard trust, so maybe that one's off the table. Give us one more from around the room. And Mr. Amin, I would like to start with you again on that to summarize here.
I would say diversity. The system has to be diverse, what we do.
Fantastic. Dean Kite, where would you leave us with? What word?
Fairer.
Fairer. Great. Mr. Sandalow.
Youth. We need to bring in the next generation and the generation after to make sustainability happen.
And Madame Tubiana, bringing us full circle here. What's the word you would leave us with?
Inclusion and citizen participation and buy-in.
Fantastic. Great. Well, we will have to leave the conversation there. I know we could certainly go on. There's always much more to say, and such great experience and insights from this group here today. So I'm honored to have the chance to have moderated this conversation. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. We really appreciate you taking the time to watch this session. And remember, it will be posted on the Zayed Sustainability Prize YouTube channel, so you can go back and watch it. You can share it widely. Thank you very much to our guests for their time today. Really appreciate it. I'm Julia Pyper, and this is the Voices of Sustainability Virtual Fireside Chat Series. Thanks so much.